Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Giulia Giardi will defend the academic thesis Illegal Waste Management Activity in the Process of Bunker Fuel Production, a criminological case study of corporate environmental crime and its enforcement. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Defense Committee, family and friends, thank you for coming today. For a number of years now, I and others before me have been investigating a very serious problem. And this problem is one of corporate environmental crime. It is a legal problem, a criminological problem, and a social problem that we should all be aware of. But to understand it, we need to go back into its context. So, what you see here is our planet on a map, with various lines running across it. And those lines are the blood and guts of our global economy. Those are ships that traverse the oceans and seas of our planet and bring us all the goods that we hold in our pockets, in our hands, the screws under your chairs, the shirts that you're wearing. But to get to where we are, those ships need to burn bunker fuel. So bunker fuel is made up of two main things: residues from crude oil refinement, and then blend components, which are lighter petroleum-based derivatives. So they can be something like diesel that you would use for your car. But unfortunately, they're not as clean as diesel, and that already gives you an idea of what's going into bunker fuel. In fact, what's often ending up in bunker fuel are waste oils. And waste oils, it's not a technical term, it's not even a legal term, but it's a descriptive term that I've used to encompass several substances, also of petroleum origin. So they can be things that are left over from manufacturing procedures, such as the making of pesticides or solvents, or your foot cream, for example. But they can also be used lubricants and fuels from machinery or ships. And all of these very toxic substances are mislabeled fraudulently for profit and then mixed into bunker fuel for ships. And that is the crime that I've been analyzing for a number of years. Now, how did I go about this? Well, I essentially answered two main research questions. The first regarding how these crimes occur and why, and the second regarding how we can actually stop the crime from happening. How did I find out that this crime was happening in the first place is very important. You see the word andante here on the screen, and this is a programma, a project that ran for a longer period of time, where some very, very dedicated and talented police officers, accompanied by a specialized public prosecutor, took the time to investigate a series of cases where the modi operandi that I briefly described to you earlier occurred. And they were actively learning about this with great effort. And they were so kind and gracious, and I would say smart, and gave me access to their case files so that I could understand the crimes that were occurring and make sense of them from a criminological perspective. Next to this wealth of data regarding the crimes, they also let me see how they were operating as a team. And of course, through their cases, I could see how enforcement had gone awry during these criminal cases. I also looked at the context in which the crimes occurs by looking at legislation, policy documents, and several other types of materials to really understand the waste oil management and bunker fuel production industries in more detail. And I used a series of theoretical frameworks and concepts to do this, the main one being situational crime prevention accompanied by crime script analysis. And this is a type of criminology where you're really looking at the immediate circumstances of when a crime occurs. So imagine the dimly lit alleyway when you risk being mugged, but in this case, in a corporate context. And that's why organizational criminology was very important. It is the field of criminology that looks at corporate crime, white-collar crime, and state crime. And of course, we're talking about harm to the environment, so green criminology, which is the field of criminology that's concerned with the planet's health and that of creatures other than human beings, was also used. And my research is also a form of empirical legal research because I actually saw how the law works in action. And by applying these various theoretical frameworks to the data that I outlined to you, then I came to a series of conclusions and recommendations, which I will outline here. The first set of recommendations I've called multi-level pinch points for intervention, and they relate much more to the first research question regarding how and why the crime occurs. Now, what you see here are the two industries that I've mentioned to you before, the bunker fuel production industry, that's the 4 trapeziums, the larger trapeziums here, and the waste oil management industry in the 3 rectangles below. And they are represented as processes here because that's actually what's happening. At each stage, new elements are being added or taken away in these 2 industrial processes. And they overlap, especially at the second point, at stage 2 of the blend component introduction, when wastes are characterized actually as products, as blend components. This is a very important moment in the process of these crimes. And the first point of intervention that I identified are the documents. So you would find it hard to believe, but the documents are actually very easily manipulatable, especially because enforcement agents don't really know what they're looking for necessarily. They see a document and they think everything should be okay. And so this is the first level. There's an alternating between a waste label and a product label, and by manufacturing a product label, then the consumers or the enforcement agencies are fooled into thinking that's what's moving from the waste management procedure or from a petrochemical production procedure into the realm of bunker fuel production is a product, where in fact it should be labeled as a waste. Now, this is possible for various industrial dynamics. One is concerning the waste product definition, another is connected to the bunker fuel sector itself, and another still is connected to shipping as well. So there are 3 intervention points at the level of industry that I've identified through my research. As I've said, there is the possibility to alternately define something as a product or as a waste. And this possibility is created by the waste management framework itself. And this is done in order to actually promote things like what we in our day-to-day lives experience as recycling. We think this is a good thing. We say, okay, well, something shouldn't just be thrown away into the garbage or under the ground or into the water. We can reuse it. That's a great idea. And that's why this possibility exists within the waste management framework. At the same time, if you go into the realm of bunker fuel production, which is sparsely regulated, there's actually very, very little in the way of enforceable regulation in the bunker fuel sector, then you have a problem, because this product that used to be a waste is not very well regulated in its industry of destination. So there's very few checks in the ways also in terms of standards that you can apply or hard rules and testing that you can apply in the bunker fuel sector that the actors in the bunker fuel sector want to apply because they're not required to at the moment in checking that these waste products or these products are not truly wastes. And of course, there's the ultimate pressure from the shipping sector. As I showed you, our global economy, the millions of containers that traverse our oceans each day, rely on cheap bunker fuel. And therefore, they exert pressure into the bunker fuel production process that then exerts further pressure into the individual moments of making the components of bunker fuel. And that is why it's profitable to use something that's not a proper blend component, and it's equally profitable not to treat waste oils properly. And the final point of intervention, I've put a big frame, the 5th point of intervention. It's about the structural conditions that make this possible. And as I've said, the blood and guts of our global economy rely on cheap fuel, which relies on cheap production. And our global economy is what sustains our states at the moment. So it is in the interest of governments to maintain this economy as it is. At the same time, intervening to stop the environmental damage and the human health damage is a risky attempt, possibly, by governments, and risks disrupting these dynamics that actually make us many powerful actors wealthy at the moment. And so these state-corporate dynamics make it difficult to intervene upon the problems that I've outlined to you. The treadmill of law is a concept from green criminology, and it's connected to this idea of state-corporate symbiosis, the idea that there's possibly a reluctance on the part of states to intervene upon corporations and industries that cause environmental harm. And this concept basically says we create legislation, we create measures, but they will remain ineffective because we don't want the ultimate power structures to be influenced too deeply by this legislation. And that is why we can continue, powerful actors can continue profiting at the expense of the environment and our health. And there's ways you can disrupt this treadmill of law. The first is through improved enforcement. There's a lot that we can do to improve the way we enforce both the management of waste oils and the production of bunker fuel. And a few of those ways I've already mentioned. But we can also, for example, learn from the practices of officers like the Andante team who have been spending a lot of time learning about these crimes. We can disrupt through civil society involvement. I'm pretty sure most of you had no idea about bunker fuel or waste oils before you entered this room. And just knowing that when we're purchasing our cheap products on Amazon, part of what's happening is what I've outlined to you above, might actually help you make a different choice. But more importantly, I think it would be important that we pay attention to how things are being regulated. When we protest in Paris, maybe we also have to consider that bunker fuel needs to be included in the objectives of the international agreements that governments make. And we also need to start thinking differently. We can't just think about recycling waste and recovering resources. We need to put the primacy on the environment and our health. Profit should come second. If we're coming up with new ways of designing our economy, it's not about maintaining the status quo with a greener way, but we actually need to think about green, healthy being the first priority, and efficiency can come later. And of course, we need to collaborate. All of us together, as I've said, we need to mobilize to make sure that our governments are making legislation in the right direction and giving resources to the right agencies so that they can build enough knowledge and expertise to be a suitable counter to the power of the industry. And we also need to collaborate possibly with those industries in a way that actually helps them to do better so that we can all live more healthily. And so with that call, I invite you all to leave this room later today and do your part to stop this from happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Faure. Professor Faure is a professor of comparative and international environmental law at the Faculty of Law of our university and the chairperson of the assessment committee.
Mrs. Candidate, I truly enjoyed reading your manuscript. It deals with a very topical subject, as you just explained. You did a thorough theoretical analysis and you engaged in an impressive empirical research by engaging with the Andante team, and you wrote the results in a nice, accessible style. Congratulations. My question deals with your methodology. You have worked intensively with Andante, and you come to the conclusion that they are doing a great job. That leads me to the question, on what basis, or on the basis of which criteria, have you evaluated the success of the Andante team? You indicate that they are very well aware of their tasks, they work on capacity building, try to improve their expertise and knowledge of the legislation, but did their intervention, for example, also give rise to more prosecutions, more convictions, and/or more compliance by companies? By the end of the day, we often require that an output in terms of enforcement efforts, like by Andante, would also lead to an outcome in terms of improvement of environmental quality. So I wondered whether you were able to measure the results of Andante in terms of either compliance or improved environmental outcomes. And it leads me in a way to a more general question, being how specific is the case of Andante and how generalizable are the results of your study? You refer to that question in your chapter 2, page 63, but I wonder if you really answered it. Now, you love Andante, and you like the job that you did with them. You even convinced us again today. But what can we learn from the work of Andante at a more general level? Or to put it differently, would the results have been different if you would not have worked with Andante, but with a different multidisciplinary team, focusing on environmental crime enforcement, on which, of course, there do exist many more? In other words, Mrs. Candidate, is your case study representative? Is it repeatable? And are the results of your study falsifiable? I'm looking forward to your reply.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I would start with the premise that the study was not intended to be an evaluation of the team's work. So I did not design research in order to measure the outcomes of the team's work. Indeed, looking at the team's work itself was actually incidental to my initial data collection, which had focused on the analysis of the criminal cases themselves. Therefore, I was not able to carry out any measurements of compliance or improved environmental outcomes, as that was not the goal of my research in and of itself, and I did not develop those tools. At the same time, I think what's very clear from the analysis that I conducted is that one of the huge issues that we have in terms of the crimes occurring and how they can be enforced has to do with the fact that enforcement agents and the Andante team members, of course, said this themselves, are not acquainted with what's happening in these industries. And I mean, there's literature, for example, the most recent in the field of really responsive regulation, if we look at Baldwin and Black's work in this direction, that they highlight this too, and also connected to environmental crimes of sorts. But they make it clear that one of the biggest problems that we have when we want to have effective enforcement that would lead to improved environmental outcomes and increased compliance is that the state agencies that carry out this enforcement have to know what they're doing, have to know what they're looking for. And what I could see through the work of the Andante team, through their dossiers, but also through my conversations with them, and looking also at what's been happening in the years prior to their work, is that we actually have more information now. We actually know what the industries are doing, and I think we can't intervene upon anything if we're basically in the dark. And so I think, although it's not measurable in any way, and I did not measure it because that was also not my aim, I do believe that there is the basis upon which we can start looking at how this information can enter into enforcement processes, and then evaluation can be carried out. But I do think that scientifically speaking, that has to be designed appropriately, and I did not do that. The generalizability of the work of the team. I think it's difficult to generalize the work of the team as a team, just because how much can we ever generalize about, the human activities? It's always very hard to generalize from a case study. What we can generalize from is more the kind of practices they adopted, the things they identified through their investigations regarding the criminal cases. We can see what kind of dynamics led to that, and I think the industry dynamics is what for me was a linchpin of my supposed generalizability in the work, is that in the end these industry dynamics apply regardless of how the cases materialize. And so I think it's more a matter of, well, how do you understand? I think the question is then rather, given these industry dynamics that can facilitate crime, what is the difference between the companies that comply and that don't comply? And of course, the data that I had did not support such an analysis, but I think that would be a very important next step. Now that we've established that there are industry dynamics that facilitate crimes in the way that I could outline, then maybe the next step is to see, okay, well, what's different? And I think generalizability would come from moving in this direction. And falsifiability, I think Yes, until we have a broader sample size of companies who comply and don't comply, I think we can't talk about falsifiability. The data needs to be there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your enlightening answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Lieselot Bishop. Professor Bishop is a professor of public and private interest at the Erasmus School of Law, Rotterdam, and also a member of the assessment committee.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Giulia, throughout the years I heard snippets of your research, through conferences, through your promoters, or sometimes through practitioners in the field that told me a little bit about the Andante team and anticipated the findings of your work. So it was a pleasure to now read the complete story. And you have a knack for storytelling, and I enjoyed being taken along on your journey through quite a few different disciplines and theories. And so my question will also be about those theories. Because we're not here just to praise your work, and I think it deserves praise, but to also hopefully push you a little further. Theoretically, your research builds on several foundations in criminology and law, but it will not surprise you, I will focus mostly on the green criminological side of things, but I'll also combine it with something else. You combine two approaches which at least initially were considered rather distinct and normatively opposed, you could say. On the one hand, environmental criminology in the situational sense of the word, as you just explained it to us earlier. And on the other hand, green criminology, the true environmental focus, if you will, which builds on insights in critical criminology. And albeit that combining these insights is more common than it is before, also in literature, compared to 20 years ago maybe, they remain different, also normatively different, I think. And I'd like to push you a little further in how your study contributed to these fields. So based on your research, what do you think are the lessons that environmental criminology should learn from green criminology? And what should green criminology learn from environmental criminology? I look forward to your answer.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your questions. Very good food for thought. Yes, so I think it's very interesting to look at it like this, and indeed this was a tension that I had to grapple with throughout the research. Although in my mind I felt that there was no real contradiction. And I feel like sometimes the contradiction is less in the premises of the theoretical frameworks than in the opinions of those who then adopt these theoretical frameworks once they are working with them. I believe so. For me, it was very important that there be some basic coherence between the theories that I used. And with all its limitations, rational choice theory is actually equally present in environmental criminology and in some of the, I don't think the frameworks from green criminology or organizational criminology or critical criminology necessarily attack the notion of bounded rationality. They do attack it as the way that we need to understand problems, but that's not questioned. So I felt like the basic understanding of a human being was not necessarily different in the two realms of criminology, and therefore I felt it wouldn't be incoherent for me to combine these approaches. So for me, that was the first understanding. The understanding of human nature, of the human being, is pretty similar actually in both fields. What is different is, of course, the understanding of how structure imprisons that human being and how much freedom a human being might have to move past that structure, and then of course at different levels in the situation and so on. And indeed that's where things are more challenging. So what can environmental criminology learn from green criminology, from critical criminology? I think a lot of people who apply the situational crime prevention framework stop at the situation. But Clark has some very beautiful schemes, in my opinion, in his earlier work, where he really does show that the routine activities that are a macro level occurrence they do filter down. These situations aren't created by magic. It's very easy to get this 25 techniques table and apply the techniques and leave it at this level. But I believe that the theories behind situational crime prevention actually have always been open to the involvement of structure. They don't speak to the extent of the structure's influence, but they do acknowledge that it's important to look at it. And I think what environmental criminology as it's practiced should learn is to always go back to that structure, not stop at the situation, and not get confused by the situation, and really see where are these situations coming from in the first place. But I do think that in the original theory that was already there. What green criminology can learn is that the structures lead to very concrete outcomes. And I think that's what I showed with the idea of the documents. These documents, which are the bread and butter of how this is happening, they are what's blinding the consumers and the authorities. They don't exist in a vacuum. They exist because of the structures, because of the framework, and because of how we interpret this is a product and this is a waste. And green criminologists, critical criminologists, have every right to say that structure has caused that document, but don't forget the document in some sense. And I think when we want to actually achieve step-by-step change, we need to look at the smaller things as well, because we can't deal with the structures immediately. We need to find the incremental steps to get us to those structures. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Wim Huisman. Professor Huisman is a professor of criminology at the School of Law of the Free University in Amsterdam. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Dear candidate, I gladly join my colleagues in applauding you and your thesis. Also for me, it was a pleasure to read the thesis. You make a strong contribution to the fields of green criminology and organizational criminology, as we just learned from the previous question. Some criminological studies on bunker fuel have been conducted, but not as rich and thorough as your thesis. And also your thesis offers a valuable contribution to the application of existing models in mainstream criminology to this particular form of corporate environmental crime. And the thesis is very well written. My question is about figure 3.9 on page 133. This is your version of the well-known triangle of routine activity theory that brings together motivated offenders, suitable targets, and the absence of capable guardians in time and place, with crime as outcome of this convergence. And with actors in that model, you make a distinction between managers, handlers, and custodians. Mm-hmm. In the triangle, you position supervisory and oversight organs with the managers. However, you do not discuss these actors in the text. So my first short question is, who are these supervisory and oversight organs? Further, in the triangle, you replace guardians in the original formulation of the theory with custodians. And on page 134, so the next page, you are looking for those custodians. You pose the question, who would be best placed to protect the environment and our health? Which are the victims of these types of crime? You look at state actors, and you're not too positive about them in the rest of the thesis, and civil society actors. But, and here's my second question, could we also find or introduce custodians within corporations? Perhaps these are the supervisory and oversight organs you mentioned, but should then they not be at the bottom of the triangle? Well, in answering my question, I think you may be skeptical, because on page 120 you state, and I quote you, the bunker fuel industry and the shipping sector are structured in such a way that no internal market-based solution currently appears possible. There's no internal pressure to change because of the deadlock of forces that result from the flow of economic incentives and pressures we have just explored. End of quote. Well, this may be true, but I think this is true for many industries and sectors. Industries and sectors that have introduced internal custodians that will fit your definition of custodians, and I quote you again, those actors and activities that may promote compliance. So let's have a look at the other industries in which they have introduced serious forms of compliance management. as a form of governmental enforced self-regulation, such as the financial industry and the prevention of money laundering. This was not a voluntary choice of the financial industry. There was no internal pressure to take on that responsibility. It was enforced upon them by law. And true, it's not flawless. There were criminal settlements, but these also have a deterrent effect. So today, about 13,000 full-time equivalents, full-time jobs in the Dutch financial industry, and that means about 1 in 5 bank employees is working in compliance. That should make a difference, does it not? So could such a mandatory, criminally enforced system of compliance management programs and compliance officers also contribute to limit illegalities in the waste oil management services and bunker fuel sectors? So could this have been a 6th pinch point in your concluding chapter?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I'll turn first to the issue of figure 3.9 and the distinctions between custodians, guardians, and managers. So, as you suggest, the supervisor and oversight organs within the firm are, I would say definitely something like a compliance unit within a corporation whose task it is to make sure that the corporation is living up to the public policy standards that are imposed upon it, or even broader standards than the ones that are imposed by binding legislation. So that is what is hinted at with the supervisory oversight organs within the firm. And I think the distinction that I make between managers and custodians is really because I'm trying to integrate, also to follow on from Professor Bishop's question, 2 frameworks. Essentially, this triangle is generally used for mainstream criminology, where you have a starker distinction between a place manager, a person who is in the place where the crime occurs. For example, imagine a bouncer at a nightclub. And the guardian who's looking after the victim, which is also could be the bouncer, but the bouncer is very much tied to the place, if you imagine. And so in organizational crimes, the place is the business premises, it's business transactions. And so it's a bit more difficult to make these distinctions, and that's why I chose that for supervisory and oversight organs, which are essentially these compliance units within organized corporations, if they are large enough to have one, then as managers, because I had this conceptualization from from situational crime prevention and mainstream criminology in mind. And I also felt like in the case of environmental crime, corporations are more and more supposed to be taking on the function of custodians. So there is more and more legislation being promulgated, putting corporations at the center, whether through the establishment of something like a compliance unit. So there's this link that's explicitly made, okay, we need to protect the environment or we need to protect human rights, and therefore a compliance unit within the organization will aid us in doing that. So this link is made also thanks to the state's involvement in imposing that. Sometimes it's voluntarily adopted, of course. But the way our society is structured right now, we kind of assume that the state is the one that's going to take care of the public interest. The state is tasked with that. Corporations are tasked with economic growth in some very stereotypical way, and the state is supposed to take care of the externalities of what the corporations are doing. And so it's from that optic that I've tried to outline these relationships between custodians and managers, and that's why I also wanted to make a distinction, because I think all of them are guardians, actually, handlers, managers, and custodians. So on the other hand, the distinction is an analytical one. It's not a true one. I think all of us are guardians, actually, of human health and the environment. But if we look at the way things are set up between business and government, this is the kind of the closest that I could come to the separation of powers, so to speak, in this way. Regarding then the internal pressure within the industry, so bunker fuel has been a product for several decades now, and environmental legislation in many fields has been growing at the same time. And if we look at it just historically, we just see that it doesn't seem to be having the same reach within the bunker fuel industry. So my statement that the internal pressures somehow don't lead to actual changes in the way it is regulated and to improve in terms of, in view of environmental outcomes, I don't want to say statement of fact. I don't think that's the data that I collected in that sense, but I think it's pretty clear that there seems to be an imbalance between the amount of growth in terms of environmental protection measures and the fact that it hasn't really come into the bunker fuel production industry, although we are clearly all very much alarmed about emissions nowadays. Yet it's still not changing in terms of its internal regulations. And there are clearly incentives for it to stay the way it is because of the economic dynamics, and that's what I was trying to highlight in that part of the work.
What I think you're doing now is you're explaining from your theoretical approach and perhaps also your ideological approach why you did not look at this. But do you think, could it work? Could enforcing those internal compliance management systems upon the industry, could that have a preventative effect?
So that's a very good question, and I think it's difficult to answer a hypothetical like that. But I do think, as you say, there is evidence that increased internal compliance mechanisms do lead to less offending. Actually, it's only through really internalizing some way of regulating and encouraging compliance within the sector that you ultimately achieve the results. You can't just rely on external regulation. That's very clear from the literature and also from the examples that you mentioned. So hypothetically speaking, I do think that would have been a very important sixth point of intervention, indeed.
Right, and after that we should empirically test that. Thank you very much.
Indeed, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Anna Beckers. Dr. Beckers is an associate professor in private law at the Faculty of Law of our university and also a member of the assessment committee.
Dear candidate, first of all, I second the compliments of my colleague. You have written a wonderful thesis that is empirically rich, theoretically grounded, and normatively ambitious. And, quite rarely the case, I would say, in legal scholarship, a piece of literature. Your thesis at times read like a crime novel, where we identify the very hidden technicalities in a very accessible way of an industry that is rarely looked at. I learned a lot when reading the thesis also about some of the macro level conditions that facilitate crime. An industry that is very relevant for the sustainability discourse, but that does not feature in it very prominently. About the relevance of documents that can facilitate crime, which invites a lot of further anthropological work, of course, of the role of documentation. Your thesis takes us to the role of law and about our policy conceptions and a lot of the definitions that we lawyers take for granted and rather innocently take for granted. And I very much enjoyed this, and of course this raises a lot of questions. And my question is related to these structural conditions, and I will take one concrete part in your thesis where you touch upon these structural conditions that facilitate crime. On page 223 and the following, you elaborate on one of the macro-level policy discourses that shape our understanding or shape the understanding of what is desirable behavior in the sustainability discourse and turn that a bit upside down to also show how it can incentivize crimes. You specifically look at the concept of the circular economy and how it may enable a criminal mindset of using circularity to incentivize the transformation of waste into products. I do find this very persuasive, but I do have a couple of questions on that. It is a very persuasive counter-narrative, and I would like to push you a bit further on that. Normatively, at the end of your thesis, you get back to this and discuss and indicate that we need to change or might need to change our perceptions on the circular economy. But you remain quite opaque on this point, as if you don't want to decide on what exactly to do with it. So let me ask you, normatively, what kind of conceptual basis should then our sustainability discourse have and our policy discourse in relation to the circular economy? Should we abolish the concept because of its counter or the counter narrative that it can create? Should we adapt it? Should we stronger regulate all the industries that are participating in or that are relevant for the circular economy? So that's the normative part of the question. And analytically, how do you get to these findings and to these normative conclusions based on your research and on your empirical research? So in short, what would you, considering the findings of your research and your empirical material, tell the EU policymaker about how it has to think about its basis for the sustainability discourse and the concept of the circular economy? Thank you. I'm looking forward to your answer.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Yes, indeed. So the choice to remain somewhat vague, especially in the conclusions on the circular economy, is, as my supervisors will surely then confirm, is that I tend to get a bit carried away with things, and I could have possibly written another chapter because of this. So I tried to cut it short where I could. Sorry. So regarding there's a very interesting body of literature that's now growing in terms of analyzing the circular economy from a critical perspective, from a sustainability perspective, and some of it is even being done in Utrecht in this country, unsurprisingly, of course. And what they're doing is applying discourse analysis to the discourse on circularity, whether this be at the EU level or the national level. And they're trying to see how are we talking about circularity? How are academics talking about circularity? How are governments talking about circularity? And how are businesses talking about circularity? And so I'm going to draw a little bit on their work, which isn't included in the thesis, but I've had the great pleasure of reading some of this material in recent months. So they see, they've done a typology, for example, of different notions of circularity, and to summarize it, there's ideas of circularity that are very much if you will, a greener capitalism, in some sense. So like the system should stay as it is, and we just have some small technical changes, some better batteries, some better techniques for recycling. I'm going to use the term recycling to make it a bit easier for us here, of recycling waste and making it more efficient to use resources. There's no real alternative to the way our economic system functions. And on the other extreme, there's what they call, I believe, transformational society perspectives on circularity. And in between, there's transformational economic concepts. So they see that this range exists both in academic literature, but also in governmental and in corporate literature or policy documents, what have you. They've done various forms of literature reviews. And what they see is that academics talk a lot more about these transformational versions of circularity, and these academics range from like engineering, because engineering is a very big field when it comes to the circular economy. Of course, there's economists themselves, and then there's some weighing in from the social sciences. It's actually the humanities and social sciences, they're the ones weighing in the least on the circular economy concept, and they're the ones that would have the most to say about the possible detrimental outcomes, possibly, of the circular economy concept. And what they see is that, yes, there's more balance, but there's very little in the way of this more technical, very pro-capitalist, if you'll allow me the stereotypization, version of circularity in the academic literature. When you look at the literature from businesses, it's very technical, not transformational almost at all. And governments seem to do they seem to do a lot of preaching on the transformational, not the full transformational society, but they definitely talk more about the fact that we need to transform the ways we conceive ownership and so on and so forth. But then when you look at the kinds of guidelines that they give in terms of how do we manage waste, essentially, it's again much more technical rather than transformational. So this is more on the normative basis in terms of like, okay, well, when we're talking about circularity, what are we really talking about? Are we just talking about repackaging stuff essentially and removing some toxins, or are we talking about rethinking the way we do things? Because if we really want to impact it, and I think that's quite clear from my findings, if we really want to affect change, we need to really talk about this structural level. And when we're just exchanging words, there's the risk that those words will be fraudulently used, as I've shown in the cases. And on the analytic level, so I'm not familiar with it yet, but what I see in this literature from discourse analysis is that you can really take these concepts and see who's using them. And you can sort of map out the coalitions of who tends to use this idea of circularity when they are publicly speaking, or maybe in even other kinds of documents. And so when we know that language is also a tool of action, we act using language actually, not just by committing fraud, but just in our conceptualization of the world and the way we are in the world, then you can start to see that if certain actors tend to use a certain idea of circularity that's more about transformation, they might be more likely to comply with the spirit of the current rules that promote sustainability. Whereas if they're more on the side of profit-making with some extra efficiency and using up less resources, they might be more on the side of, I'm not going to say of the criminal side, but that's the end of the spectrum, if you will. And I think, just like Professor Heisman mentioned, that we should study empirically how these compliance mechanisms work within the industry, this could be a part of it, right? We need to see how are these compliance mechanisms then sort of creating these definitions within the industry that move more towards compliance as opposed to violation. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Elvira Leubel. Dr. Leubel is an assistant professor in criminal law and criminology at the Faculty of Law of our university and also a member of the assessment committee.
Dear candidate, dear Giulia, first I would like to congratulate you on your impressive dissertation on a very serious societal problem. You used an interesting set of empirical data and applied a sound theoretical framework to examine the phenomenon of illegal waste oil management activity in the process of bunker fuel production and how it can be limited. Without a doubt, your study constitutes an original and excellent contribution to the academic work on criminology and organizational and green criminology in particular. I have a question about the methodology used in your study. Most of the empirical data that you employed in your study consists of information put together and at your disposal by the Andante team. This data allowed you to develop valuable insights into and critical reflections on the work and approach of this important guardian. However, there are also other authorities that deal with the crime of illegal waste oil management, most notably the ILT, which serve as important guardians within the sector. Can you reflect on the reasons of why you have not involved these guardians in your research, for instance, by interviewing them?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Indeed, that is a very important matter to further investigate how the ILT works in this field, because they are guardians that can intervene across the board in the sense that they can already intervene at much earlier stages or with, I guess from a responsive regulation perspective, with measures that are a bit lower on the pyramid. The reason is a very practical one. And it is the design of the research was such that when I came to stumble upon it, in some sense, also the information about enforcement, the sort of the day-to-day information about practical enforcement, when I was made privy to the workings of these guardians, I had to think on my feet quite quickly and see, okay, well, how will I do this? And so the design was very much concentrated on how the crimes occurred initially, and that was the bulk of my data collection. And once I did encounter the work of the team, not just the product of their work in terms of their investigation files, then I had to find a way of making sense of it. But it wasn't designed that I would focus on the enforcement side and then look at the range of measures, again, referring to the responsive regulation pyramid. My design wasn't to look at the whole pyramid and see how it functions and hear the voices of the various agents that could operate within it. I do agree that if we want to understand actually also how the crime occurs and not just enforcement in itself, it would be very important to get as many of those voices involved. But then beyond the ILT, which is a very important organization, I think at some stage then the corporate sector itself would also need to be involved, because indeed, as also has been said, they are also very important in terms of the actual immediate effect they can have in limiting these types of activities. so as I said, the reason is a practical one. That's not to say that I didn't hear at all from members of the ILT. So as part of the research, I was given really the wonderful opportunity of actually attending some of the action days that the Andante team was involved in. And these are days where they conduct systematic checks with several authorities at the same time. And so this is not just ELT, but there's also port authorities, customs. And on one occasion when I was there were also authorities from other member states coming to see the work of the team. So it was very exciting to be part of this. And on that occasion, I also got the chance to speak with some members of the ILT. Unfortunately, those conversations were not a representative sample, so I could not use them in that way. But I could get a gist of the way the ILT somehow at least relates to these activities that the Andante team was conducting. And I believe that in my analysis, although it might not have come out explicitly, I stayed true to what I understood from these conversations, at the very least. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer. Professor de Sadeleer is a professor of EU law and environmental law at the Jean Monnet Chair of Université Saint-Louis in Brussels. Very much welcome.
Yes. In your third chapter, you highlight the difficulties to draw the dividing line between waste byproducts, end-of-life waste, as well as product. It appears to me, in reading your PhD, that there is a significant regulatory failure. So you try to focus on the manner in which public authorities could enforce the regulation, but it occurs to me that the failure is taking place at the level of regulations. One cannot expect too much from the EU lawmaker. You've been emphasizing time and again that whatever directives pose as an obligation, there is immediately an exception, and the exception contains sub-exceptions and so on and so forth. From a Dutch point of view, what will you advise to your government and to your lawmaker to regulate correctly the sector?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I would definitely agree that, especially as regards the bunker fuel sector, there is definite regulatory failure at the international, EU and national level. In terms of the waste management framework, there's room for interpretation. And I think that continues to be the problem. I think there's a lot that's been done, and I mean the EU and therefore its member states, including the Netherlands, are certainly at the forefront of aiming for high standards of environmental protection. So I would say that the regulatory failure there is less dire. And to me, the regulatory failure is not so much in the words of the laws, but in establishing a system that can give those laws a true meaning in reality. So we can aspire to very high levels of environmental protection and say we don't want these types of toxins released into the biosphere, and therefore we will not allow these substances to be used as products anymore, but we will label them as waste, which means they will have to be dealt with in a certain way. There's a logic to waste management, which is this label is supposed to be protective for all of us. When we say it's waste, it's not just because it's waste, because it's not just because one wants to discard it, but it's because it's dangerous. And this is the way that the system is set up. This is our way of identifying, I guess, the evil in our industrial system. This waste label is in some, if we want to look at it a little bit from this normative perspective, I think that's what the waste label does. And so when we talk about regulatory failure, I think it's relative in the waste management framework, because I think it's gone a long way already. What's problematic in the waste management framework is that it seems to forget that wastes come from somewhere and can go somewhere else. It makes it possible for them to come from somewhere. Something can become a waste, or something can avoid the waste label. It's acknowledged in some implicit way. And then it's acknowledged that something can be done. That's why we have very detailed, when we talk about the Netherlands, we have the Landelijk Afvalbeheerplan, which is the waste policy plan guidelines that tell us for each waste stream what can be done with this waste and what can be done so that it actually can become a safe product. and so there are rules there, but they forget that waste is embedded in a broader system, and it's not just the capitalist system, but it's a system where so many things are interconnected. These wastes can come from so many sources and be of so many kinds, and can go in so many places and end up in so many different types of products. So the regulatory failure is in engaging not just with the technicalities of waste management and saying hazard A, hazard B, type of purification machinery A, type of purification machinery B, and putting that into a permit. It's engaging with the reality of a firm operating in this sector and understanding that firm is getting the possibility to take these wastes and profit by not treating them properly. And that comes from the realm where that waste is generated. And it can profit in the realm where that waste might be used. And the legislation doesn't incorporate that. Now, I understand that it's problematic to expect a national legislator, let alone an EU or an international legislator, engage with such detailed information. So in my opinion, it's about creating the appropriate communicative channels and collaborative channels, that's also why I emphasize collaboration, at several levels, from the firm level to the international level, because these are activities that aren't just happening in the Netherlands or in the EU, whereby we can check together. And one of the suggestions that I make in my conclusion about this electronic document network is the idea that those who have access to the labeling process of something as a waste or a product shouldn't just be the companies that can profit from this differential labeling, and shouldn't just be the authorities, but it should be, on some level, most of us, that it becomes a deliberative process. Not in the immediate, of course. It's not like every time waste is generated, we start a town hall and we say, how shall we label this waste? That's not what I'm trying to say. I think it's more about the fact that we all need to take ownership of the fact that we live in this world, we buy these products, we travel we take ownership, we take ownership, and we participate where we can in these deliberative spaces about what we want to do with our planet and with our health.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Bishop for a final question.
Okay, thank you. You did a unique fieldwork, probably even richer than the manuscript could capture. You mentioned that you did not do action research, and I agree, and yet you did play a role in the research setting. The setting influenced you, and you influenced the setting. Did you go native?
Highly esteemed opponent. I don't think I went native. So the procedure in terms of how I didn't go native, I think it's important to highlight that throughout the research process, I was accompanied by two very, very talented criminologists who kept me in check on many, many levels, including the going native. So I can recall many meetings where like, yes, but have you considered this? Yes, but oh, have you thought about it in this way? And have you noticed this aspect of the work of the team or of the results from the research? And I do believe that my supervisors did a lot to keep me non-native, I guess, on some level. I'm very honest. I think that's very clear also in the thesis. I am thoroughly impressed with the work of the team, and I'm thoroughly grateful as a citizen with the work of the team. But that does not mean that they are flawless.
You may briefly finish your answer.
Thank you. And indeed, I believe that in the 6th chapter of the book, I do highlight some of the ways in which the work of the team either couldn't reach in terms of changing the situation, but also how it might be skewed when we look at it from a more theoretical perspective of responsive regulation and so on, how that could be adapted in order to fit better in with what we know about regulating corporations.
Thank you. Giulia Giardi, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Giulia Giardi, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Nelen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise? Oh, I need the microphone. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Giulia Giardi, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Esteemed Dr. Giardi, dear Giulia, many congratulations on reaching this milestone in your academic career and in your life. I think, well, I'm sure, also on behalf of course, Roland, Moeland, and myself, this is a very special moment for you, your family, friends, but for the two of us as well. And I can imagine that it must feel as an enormous relief that the job is done. Finally, I can almost hear you thinking, and yes, it took you maybe more time to wrap up the PhD research successfully as we anticipated at the start, but there were good reasons for that. Moreover, your endeavor paid definitely off, and you wrote an outstanding PhD thesis, and the way you defended it today was excellent. It was really passionate. It was, Giulia, in a very good shape, excellently done. Yes, dear Giulia, we as your PhD parents, or as you called us in your acknowledgement, Doktorvätern in German. We are very proud of our Dr. Kind. I heard yesterday, by the way, that that is not a common thing in Germany to call yourself a Dr. Kind, but we liked it. And it has been an adventure and a great pleasure to be on this journey with you and Roland. I think we were an excellent team. A journey that started in September 2015. And originally, we had another type of research in mind, and you described that yourself in the book, because, well, we had a study in mind related to organized waste trafficking, the Camorra crime syndicate. So there were other ideas at the start, but I still remember vividly, and you also described it in the book as well briefly, how you came up with the idea to go to the assessment committee, the internal committee within the faculty, bringing a mobile phone, just to show to them, listen, do you know what waste is all about, what this machine is made of, what is being done with it when we no longer use it anymore. And that was already a way of presenting that Roland and I, we said to each other, well, this is innovative, creative, it's very convincing, the way, and it's, I saw it again today, the way you talk about things passionately, you use your arms and you do things. This is Giulia when you have the feeling, yes, she's feeling well, then you can see it the way you behave. But our idea started to shift and change at some point when we were thinking about, okay, and I think it's good to see them sitting there in the second row, the team, Andante, Luc, Jos and all the others. The way the first visit to Rotterdam, the three of us, when we were there and talking about waste, but then in a completely that we started thinking about, hey, bunker fuel, the relationship there. But increasingly we thought, hey, this is a very interesting angle to take, a topic to embrace. And well, I think we owe them a lot. They granted you an access to, well, very unique set of data. And on top of that, the team allowed you, well, to observe, to interview them, and to be amidst of them for quite a while. Based on the literature you had read and the data you had collected, we had fascinating meetings and we had challenging academic discussions. I think the audience will get an idea about that because, again, the book is, well, I don't know exactly how many pages. It could be doubled, but this was one of the things we had to do, of course, to say, well, keep it concise in a way and keep it coherent. And I think you managed in doing that. But we learned a lot about the dynamics, the mechanisms in the world of waste and oil, and the entwinement of two industries, and particularly how those two worlds actually create opportunities for crime and deviant behavior. But our meetings were not only satisfying in terms of content and academic debate, but also we had a lot of fun. I think there were quite a number of moments where we could laugh about all kinds of things, not only in relation to waste, but many other things. Remember that came up when I was thinking about this, when the three of us featured in a video as Batman, Robin, and Catwoman. And recently you starred as a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang during the party of Kim, after she had defended a PhD thesis. So you were always into that as well. And that's what I think reflects also the way you are engaging in the group and how you like doing this kind of things as well. However, unfortunately, your PhD trajectory has not always been a smooth journey. You had to face a number of, well, personal serious problems, and I'm extremely proud of the way you dealt with those issues and in these situations, your perseverance, your fighting spirits became very clear, and the way you actually started working on the PhD research again and the way how you finalized it really is something to be extremely proud of. Fortunately, there were also, of course, many happy moments in your personal life during the trajectory that also caused some delay. Meeting and marrying Siavash, moving to a new house, but of course, particularly giving birth and raising two lovely children, Luca and Lara. They have enriched your life in many ways. And of course, Roland and I understood very well that, well, their health, well-being, and happiness comes first. It's more important than writing a PhD. But on the other hand, we kept on putting, well, call it subtle pressure on you a little bit. Do not, try to find the time to write, to wrap it up. It takes time. Don't neglect your promise to finalize it. And in the end, you did. I think a crucial moment was an email we received in December 2021 when you said, well, Siavash and I have been talking. We have been thinking about a plan, how to organize this to enable me to have the time to write it. And then we knew for sure, yes, this is the moment. Now it's going to happen. And yes, you found the time and spirit that you needed taking the final step in the whole journey. Dear Giulia, your personality traits that helped you in finding the necessary balance between work and your private life, one of the, I think, relevant traits is that you are very organized and structured. And we also observed that in relation to teaching. Yeah. Over the years, you've been involved in various courses. You performed excellently in that respect as well. But it does not come as a surprise that your favorite course was organizational crime. That was our baby, more or less. And you could also, in relation to the things you were doing yourself in your research, you could actually show that to the students, and you were very motivated and engaged. The students very much appreciated that even more when you actually gave them to a preparing document, a special document for the discussion leaders. I do not know of any tutor actually preparing that for discussion leaders, that they know how to actually do that kind of thing, but that somehow shows the person you are, that actually wanted to help them, to guide them through the whole process. And we also recognize this structured way of working prior and during the several meetings we had, because we not only received chapters beforehand, but we also received adapted timelines, notes from previous meetings, we got an agenda for the things we had to discuss. So it started at least in an organized way. I wouldn't say it always, when we look at the meetings itself, somehow we went in all kinds of directions, but nevertheless, the start was always a very structured one. And your presentation and defense today underline how much progress you've made, I think, in mastering and combining so many disciplines. Because when I first met you, I remember that it was in the Master Honors track. You were, and you considered yourself primarily, and you often said that, well, I'm a legal scholar with an interest in criminology. But look at the book now. Look at what you've been doing and how you've mastered all kinds of, because you did not take a bachelor in criminology or a master as such. So that is really impressive. And what I see now is a mature academic who managed to include and combine theoretical notions from so many disciplines. And that is, at least, that's fascinating, and that's very impressive. And you succeeded in analyzing a complex phenomenon, and you were writing saying, okay, when I listened to the way you addressed the question of my colleague, Professor Bisschop from Rotterdam, that you said indeed, well, the crime script analysis and the whole ideas about situational crime prevention I can use in trying to find out what are they doing, what are the modi operandi, what are the different steps that have to be taken. But as from the start you had the feeling that will not be enough. I have to add a layer to it, or more layers to it. And you explained that also during the presentation. So that you indeed thought, well, let's start by using one concept, but also in making sense out of what you found. You needed other concepts, and a number of them. Of course, responsive regulation, crime facilitative environments, you name it. At the end, it was also mentioned on the slide in your presentation, you went even one step further, and you, with reference to the treadmill of law, you in the end said, well, it's related, it's deeply rooted, of course, in our political economic system. And this is also something which, this is Giulia, that we know from the start, ideologically driven. You say, sometimes I get carried away, but that was fascinating for us as well, and we like it, let's say. But at the same time, what we had to do as supervisors, of course, is, of course, keep this for the epilogue, come back to it. If you want to convey a message to the audience, and you did that, the fact that the audience started applauding after your presentation says something about your final words as well. Because I think this is indeed a message to society at large. It showed the academic relevance, societal relevance of the things you've been doing. And what you say at the end, when you say, I've quoted that here, the end of the book, that is one of the hard, I would say, and we both fully agree with it, because addressing the main challenges of today, such as the urgent matter of stalling or even denying the climate crisis that is connected to polluting activities like the ones that have been discussed in the book, we have to be willing to discuss and reconsider the normative foundations of our current system. Well, we have been briefly discussing that, and I think that is a highly valid point, and we have to take it seriously. Dear Giulia, it has been a great privilege accompanying you and supervising you on this fascinating journey. The world of oil may be messy, but you came out without a stain, I would say. Congratulations again to you, your paronyms, to Constantijn, to Kim, but of course also to Siavash, to your parents, sitting over there, to your acquired parents, your two lovely children, Lara and Luca. They are not here, I understood.
I'll come late. Yeah.
But of course, they probably do not realize yet what a great achievement their mother has just accomplished, but nevertheless, and your many friends and colleagues, they may be here online, and they are present here, of course, as well. I think it's time now to relax, to celebrate. Let's go to the Tapijnkazerne and have a great lunch and have a lot of fun. Enjoy it, and you really deserve it. Well done. Excellently done.
Dear Dr. Giardi, also on behalf of Maastricht University and of course also on behalf of the Faculty of Law, I congratulate you with the degree that you just have acquired. And I also want to extend our congratulations to your family, to your relatives, to your friends, those who are present here in the hall, but also those who are present online. After closing this ceremony, the reception will not take place in this building. It was already mentioned, but in Brasserie Tapijn, which is about 5 minutes walk from here. It's very easy to find. So for the audience, do not wait outside the hall to congratulate the young doctor, but please go immediately to the Brasserie Tapijn. Thank you all, and I hereby close this academic session.